Hi there. It's September 20th, and we're continuing our journey through Paul's letter to the Galatians. We're in chapter 5, and we're completing the chapter by reading verses 13 to verse 26. So Paul has been talking about standing in freedom, but he says in standing in this freedom in Jesus, don't use it as an opportunity to do what your flesh wants, the merely physical things, the desires that are just base physical things. Because he says actually the Spirit frees you, has freed you, not for yourself, not for self-fulfillment, but actually for self-donation. And so Paul points back to the teaching way back in Leviticus 19:18, where he says the law is summed up in one word: love your neighbor as yourself. We know that Jesus himself taught on these things. He said, be careful, because if you don't follow this, you'll end up fighting with each other and biting and devouring one another, and that isn't going to be to the glory of Christ. And then he encourages his readers to live by the Spirit, and this is a big part of the end part of this this letter. Paul is saying, if you live by the Spirit, then you won't fulfill those pulls, those desires of your just basic physical desires that lead you off track. Said, because if you walk in the Spirit, then you will be led by the Spirit. You'll be sons of God, led by the Spirit. It's a wonderful way also of escaping the law and of being free of the religious observances, because the Spirit is not bound up into religious observances. And then he compares the works of the flesh, he calls it, the works of the purely physical, with the fruit of the Spirit. Now it's interesting that he balances these two. He calls them the works of the law, erga to normal, the works, whereas he calls the fruit of the Spirit, karpos to pneumato, the fruit of the Spirit. It's not the works of the Spirit, it's the fruit of the Spirit. So as the Spirit works in us, he produces the fruit. But the works of the law, Paul lists these works, the things that are clearly not godly, the things that clearly are not going to build us up. There's sins like adultery, stealing, lying, all of these things that he says are the outcome. Erga means the outcome, the products, if you like, of the actions of the life that is cut off from the Spirit of God. But then he makes clear and he says, but the fruit of the Spirit, when the Spirit is at work in us, when the Spirit is free in us to be who he wants to be, when God is at work in us and free to be who he wants to be, and we're loving our neighbor, then the things that produces are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And then Paul says at the end of this, against this there's no law. We haven't got to worry about breaking any law, because there is no law against these things. And this is what he's encouraging the Galatians to do, not to try and produce love, joy, peace, patience and all of those things, not to fight to produce them. An apple tree doesn't sit there going, oh, I've got to produce fruit. It's when the life of God, when the Spirit of God, if you like, when the sap of God is rising within us, that the tree naturally produces these things, all of the wonderful things that Paul lists here. And he's encouraging us then to walk in the Spirit, to live by the Spirit. If we live by the Spirit, when we will be in accordance, we'll be in accord, we'll be in agreement with the Holy Spirit, not fighting among ourselves. You know, God is so concerned that we experience him, that we encounter him. It's not about doing things to please him. It's about relationship with him. And by his Spirit, he leads and guides us. Let's seek again today to be filled with his Holy Spirit, that there be no space in us that is not touched by God. And let's live our lives with our hearts set on those things. Have a very good September 20th.